Hello, everyone, and thank you for attending today's webinar, Speed and Agility, 5 Reasons to Automate Your Enterprise Content. I'm Patricia Lundy, the Director of Marketing at Aragon Research, and I will be your moderator today. Before we get started, we just want to cover a few housekeeping items. As you can see on your console, you have a lot of applications and resources available for your use. If you have any questions during the webcast, you can click on the Q&A widget at the bottom and submit your question. We will answer your questions during our Q&A session, which will take place at the very end of today's presentation. You can also expand your slide area by clicking on the Maximize icon on the top right of the slide area. If you run into any technical difficulty, please click on the Help widget. It has a question mark icon and covers common technical questions. Please note that the audio portion of today's webinar is streaming through your computer speakers. There is no dial-in. Be sure to check your speaker volume to ensure that it is turned on and that it's at an audible level. If you are not seeing the slide movement in your console, please refresh your browser, and if problems persist, please clear your browser cache or you can submit a question in the Q&A. Okay, now I think we are ready to begin. I'd like to introduce today's presenters, Matt Fleckenstein, CMO of Nintex, and Jim Lundy, CEO and Lead Analyst at Aragon Research. Thank you so much for joining us today, and I will go ahead and hand it off to Jim to get us started with automating our enterprise content.
Great, Patricia, thanks a lot. Matt, great to have you here. Matt's a battle-tested veteran in tech, and he just joined recently as CMO of Nintex, so we're glad to have you here today, Matt.
Thanks very much, Jim. Excited to be here.
So the flow for today is I'm going to give a little short overview of the market, what we're talking about in automating your content. We're going to go through the 5 reasons why, and then Matt's going to take you through a little bit of overview of one of the major providers that he's at, which is Nintex. So I'll dive right in without any further ado, and just as a heads up, this is being recorded, and people that register will be able to get a recording, as Patricia said. So let's talk about the future of work. The future of work is really, today, kind of murky. We're kind of in between the analog past, which as you see is paper, and the digital future, which we're going to talk about as really the topic of du jour for today. We're still stuck in paper land. There's still an awful lot of paper in our work-based processes. And that's really one of the things we say is really it's one of the first steps to solve. But I would tell you honestly, I've been in this space for a long, long time. Document-based processes sometimes are viewed as boring by IT professionals because they'd rather deal with more things like big data. But my take is that this is a big data problem. It's a content problem, and it's a digital transformation on-ramp. It's one of the first things that you should solve. And what do I mean by that? Well, we really have, different generations of automation, and they kind of deal with 2 things, people and paper. If you go all the way back to, on the slide here, you see it's actually a scene from a movie in the early 60s of people sitting at desks using things like calculators and typewriters. And what were they using typewriters for? To create documents. And those documents generally had to be moved around through the mail system or in folders that were carried around by people. Then you moved into an era, almost 25 years ago where, mainframes started spitting out letters from banks that said, here's your statement. It used to be called database publishing, but still very, very manual and also not very automated. It was really, kind of just a mail merge on a mainframe. And we come to this thing today where we're not only talking about, the ability to generate documents, but the ability to move them around and do that in a semi or fully automated way. That's really what we're here to talk about today. And how do we get from, the middle to the right? Because I would make an argument that today, for most of you that are on this call, you may be partially automated, but we're going to give you some big ideas about how could you go fully automated, where you can save time for your knowledge workers, whether it be sales professionals, communications professionals, contract professionals. We still really spend an awful lot of time creating documents and then manually moving them around. So again, that's the premise for today. What do we want to really talk about? Well, we want to dive in and talk about, a couple things. The things I'm going to hit are some key trends that are driving this. We are going to hit those 5 key reasons why you should deploy this thing we're calling workflow and content automation. And then talk about some use cases before we hand over to Matt, who will really dive into some of the things that Nintex is helping their customers with. So let's just keep going. Talk about a couple of the key trends. A couple that really, if we just say, I only had one slide to show you today, this would probably be it. There's really 4 things that are coming together at the same time that are making it possible to drive this shift to fully automated content and workflow. One is cloud computing. Even as short as 3 years ago in 2014, people were still kind of giving me a hard time about cloud. Like, we're not really sure. And, some of the people that were delivering cloud stories also weren't sure. They were still kind of hedging. And really, in the last 3 years, you've seen basically everybody double down. You're seeing IT leaders make announcements that they just spent $20 million moving their legacy applications to a cloud platform. Why is cloud important? Because it enables things like connectivity, and it also enables innovation. It pretty much means that you get out of this, you still have to have people that help you configure, but the idea of having consulting firms manually build connectors is kind of one of the things that's fading away because of things like APIs and microservices. This thing called digital apps. So there's, the first generation was mobile apps, and mobile apps basically gave you that, information on a mobile device, a mobile form factor. When we talk about digital apps, it's basically about combining business processes into something that can work really, really well on a mobile device. We'll talk more about that a little bit later. We're also talking about today content automation. It's one of the biggest barriers to businesses today. And again, sometimes it's not top of mind, but what's happening is business leaders are making it top of mind. They're savvy and they're starting to realize, like, wait a minute. I was just at a cocktail party, and one of my peers asked me if I was actually automating, my document-based processes. Was I using things like e-signature, and doing my transactions digitally? And they come back to the office on Monday and say, hey, wait a minute, those guys are beating us. Their days outstanding and time to close on sales deals is much faster than ours. And so you're seeing senior executives, whether it's a GM or even the COO or even the CEO, demanding that this be one of the fundamental focus areas for IT and the business leaders to come together on. And so in some cases, you see IT actually following, not leading on this, because they think paper and stuff like that is boring and it's not a high priority. And my IT guys really don't want to work on that stuff. Well, guess what? It's the digital on-ramp, and again, that's the thing we're going to spend time on today as our deep dive. And then, when you look at, predictive and artificial intelligence, the race to make applications smarter, we're going to talk about that when it comes to this area of analytics. But let's just say that fundamentally, computers can be taught patterns, and when they can be taught patterns, they can recognize things generally faster than a human can. So the idea is, how do you make apps, those digital apps, how do you make those intelligent? And again, that's one of the new races as well. Very overhyped. A lot of things today that people say they have AI are really just rules. But we'll talk a little bit about relative to content analytics too. So the bottom line on all this is that humans and computers are going to work closer together than they ever have. And my premise that I'll talk about later is that we think computers are going to be able to do more of the document assembly than they ever have through advanced applications in this workflow content automation space from people like Nintex. And again, Matt's going to be giving you that overview in just a few minutes. So what about the eras of content? So, I've lived content for a long time. I was at Gartner. I ran the content management team. We consolidated the document management stuff into what we called ECM. And I vividly remember it because there were a lot of vendors that were not happy about that because they were no longer leaders in that market when we declared ECM as the future. But really, we think we're leaving the ECM area. It's not about storage and managing and tracking records. It's really about automating content and then finding out more information in that dark data, because today you really can't see inside of content very well. It's dark. And so we think that automation and analytics are the next eras, and that's the new race. And that's why when you look at some of the content management vendors, they're being consolidated. There's not as much money in that. I mean, EMC, one of the, Documentum, one of the titans of this space, was just sold to OpenText, which has become a roll-up company. And are you going to get innovation from there, or are you going to get innovation from some of the more nimble players that, one of which is here today? So this is a big deal. We called this about a month ago, and people are still reacting to it. So the tagline we say about content automation is content in motion. It's not about storing and watching and tracking what happens to a fixed piece of content. It's about making it move around faster so I can speed up my business processes. And then we'll talk a little bit later about content analytics as well, which is also a big deal about understanding what's actually happening. So when we talk about, workflow and content automation, we're really talking about bringing some legacy areas together, such as, the whole workflow area and this area of, customer communication management, or if you're a sales leader, DocGen, the stuff that will basically assemble documents for you, into one new, combined category that will tie in as a platform to all these different areas. And so why is this important? Well, two things. One is a lot of companies have to buy two products. I'll talk about that later. But the content's usually locked in siloed applications. You can't get the things to move around. And it's also harder to say, okay, I got to have an application to build my documents and an application to do the workflows that are associated with it. So this is really what we're talking about. And again, we think you see the strategic imperative that workflow and content automation, or WCA, is going to consolidate the legacy BPM and CCM markets into this new business application category. Now, Matt, I know this is one of the big bets that Nintex has placed as a pioneer in this new market. Can you talk a little bit about how you've evolved from just workflow to a full content automation stack?
Yeah, sure thing, Jim. Thanks. Look, Nintex has been around since 2006, and we really have, in that time frame, helped to automate through using workflow millions of business processes that literally run billions and billions of times. And so we've got great visibility into what's happening across automation of business processes, almost regardless of industry or regardless of where that's happening. Our roots started in the SharePoint ecosystem, but as you'll see in a little bit, we've expanded much beyond just working in the SharePoint and Microsoft ecosystem to include places like Salesforce, Box, Dropbox, etc. But what you learn is regardless of ecosystem, regardless of industry, the process automation really comes down and involves three critical components almost every single time. There's people, there's data, and there's content. And so for us, going into content automation was a very natural thing. As you look at people automating business processes that involve content, we would routinely see that, hey, these processes that we've automated get bogged down at the content phase of things. And so a couple of years ago, we acquired a company called DrawLoop, which was in the document generation space, that literally goes out and helps you dynamically and automatically create documents on the fly, taking data maybe from Salesforce, coupling it with content that you have stored in your content repositories, whether that's SharePoint, Box, Dropbox, etc., and automatically creates the documents, and then with our workflow as a backbone can route them to the appropriate people for reviews, for approvals, for signatures, etc. And so for us, it was a very natural progression, Jim, that I really think speaks to where what you're talking about in terms of where this market's going.
Great, thanks, Matt. Let's keep going. So this other thing that's really a hot topic is this area of what we call digital assistants. You've probably heard of things like chatbots and also another term called robotic process automation. You could really look at two things. One, workflow and content automation as a platform, which is really could be in some application use cases be viewed as robotic process. But for those of us that are in the content space, and we're not just into screen scraping, we think this idea of a workflow and content automation assistant that goes beyond what a basic chatbot would be able to do is kind of a big deal. So everybody's talking about this. The main area we've seen chatbots deployed in is in support. We think the big thing is AI-based bots But we do think when you actually look at applying this to these types of problems, would a contract manager have a workflow and content automation assistant that would he or she would be able to talk to, in a chat box or via voice, and allow them to basically speed up some of the things like, generate these documents, done. We think by 2021, you'll get to a point where you'll have full language and action that can be initiated by this quote-unquote digital assistant. And again, there's a lot of lenses that we call the digital lenses of these different, individual things. There's a lot of people that are getting hyped up about one particular thing, but, if you're in the content space, you need to start thinking about, again, the big watchword is automation and the different pathways to do that. And we think that there's quickly emerging a set of players that's going to allow you to not only speed it up, but to have, again, computer assistants that will actually talk to you and help you get some of those things done. So what's this all mean? I've got a prediction. I made this a little earlier this year. We think by the year end 2018 that smart documents are going to be able to auto-create and route themselves because of workflow and content automation. So enterprises that take advantage of this new tech stack, and we're kind of calling it a platform, are going to transform faster, and they're going to gain a competitive advantage because then your people can spend more time doing other things instead of moving paper around. So it's a big deal, and we'll talk about call to actions at the end, but if you're thinking about this, this is something that is non-trivial. I'm going to allow the software applications to do more of the lifting and to do it more predictably so I can free up my knowledge workers to do other things. Speaking of which, one of the things we made a call on last month in September was the rise of what we call intelligent content analytics. And even since we've announced, and by the way, Nintex has had stuff for a while. I'll ask Matt, I'll have a question for you in just a second. But we basically said, it's not about, again, storing content anymore. It's about analyzing what's happening in documents, in voice files, in images, and in video. We think the low-hanging fruit right now is basically content analytics. And Matt, I know that it was actually last year that Nintex announced your Hawkeye analytics platform. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure, Jim. Look, I think, we've come to the realization that intelligence, as you're talking about it here, regardless of what you're doing, really is the new currency of business. And so about a year ago, we launched a product called Nintex Hawkeye, which really focuses on really three types of intelligence as it relates to workflow and content automation. The first of them is around process intelligence. So you've automated a bunch of your processes. How can we bring intelligence to you that let you understand what's happening, what's working, where are things getting bottlenecked, those types of things. The second of them is around operational intelligence. And so this is all about bringing intelligence into actually your businesses. If you think about automating these workflow and content processes, all of them are designed to drive some type of business outcome. As you said earlier, Jim, it could be how can I actually speed up my quote-to-cash processes so that I can actually get contracts and proposals out the door faster and revenue in the door in much quicker time frames. So again, how can we give you insight into what's actually happening in your business? And from a velocity perspective, are you increasing in velocity? Are you increasing in value in the ways that you want to? And the third of these is around really predictive intelligence. So how can we actually apply some of the stuff you were talking about in terms of machine learning or artificial intelligence or natural language processing to really actually help you predict kind of the things that are going to happen as they relate to your workflow and content automation. So say you're sending something out for approval, how can we be smart, how can we be intelligent, and how can we predictively route it to the appropriate person that has, signing authority or approval authority on that particular thing, who's most likely to kind of approve it or address it or review it in the shortest time frame, maybe given the time of day, the day of the week, whatever the case may be. So I think those three things are really at the heart of Hawkeye: process intelligence, operational intelligence, and predictive intelligence. And I think they're actually, Jim, if you go back to your areas of content, are really helping to drive Nintex from that content automation area, again, which we just talked about in terms of us getting into with document generation, and now pushing us really into that content analytics era.
Yeah, I think that's it's pretty strategic. And again, you guys are actually ahead of the curve because Hawkeye came out last year. So great job on that. We'll come back to that more later in the webinar. So let's put this all together and make a shift before we talk about these 5 key things that you want to leave this webinar with, and talk about the technologies. So this is our branded methodology around tracking technologies that we call our technology arcs. We have one for digital transaction management and content management for 2017. And so there's 3 arcs. There's the emerge arc, the adopt arc, and the mature arc. You could kind of call this a modern hype cycle because we don't have a trough. And the reason we don't have a trough is this. Business leaders, we've been tracking this for 5 years, actually 6 years this year. The business leaders call us, and they only want to talk about stuff on the emerge and rising up into the adoption arc. Why do they do that? For example, you can see we have things highlighted here, workflow and content automation in the emerge arc, and we actually have it rated as with a triangle, which means it's transformative potential. They call us up and they say, can you talk to us about why you think workflow and content automation, and then look below that, content analytics, is transformational? Because we want to get ahead, and we think if we deploy these new things that we can beat our competitors. That's the reason why they want to know about these new things. If you look at the areas in blue on the right, in mature, some of our friends, sometimes maybe in IT, are looking to save money because they have limited budgets. The money for the budget is actually with the business leader. And so, hey, I've got 20 repositories for ECM, Jim. Could I get down to 15? And so we end up working with them to try to figure out how could they get out of some of those. One of the reasons they're trapped is they have hard-coded workflows and they can't get out of it. If you look at customer communications management, look, I helped invent that market. And that market has gotten a little long in the tooth, and that's why when you actually look at the emerging market, workflow and content automation, that's the new thing, because it generally is, I can spit out, an electronic document, I can spit out a paper document, but I can't do anything else with it. In fact, a lot of those vendors can't even integrate with, places like Salesforce, where the data resides. So again, a lot of things happening here. Digital transaction management, which again started with these signature providers. Nintex is in this space too. How can I speed up my digital transactions? That's moved from emerge in 2014 all the way well into adoption this year. So again, this is just to try to put a lens around all these moving parts in the content areas. And if you're a content professional or a business leader, you want to be looking at this tech arc from the left-hand rising side and saying, if I can deploy this faster, can I beat my competitors? And again, it's some of these business leaders call us up are very savvy, very technically savvy too, and they're not afraid. So that's the thing that's changed. That's why you shouldn't worry about whether something's in a trough or not. You should actually worry about, are the other guys beating us because they got it and they found a cloud provider that could deploy it really fast? Well, again, we'll talk about deployment things later on. So at the end of the day, so our first piece of recommendations, as in the heart here of our presentation, is number 1 is to buy and integrate fewer products. If I can buy fewer products, I can automate faster. I mean, it's as simple as that. So in 2010, this workflow and content automation market did not exist. It was still about buying a workflow product and buying a customer communication management product, i.e. also called DocGen. If you look at today, 2017, there's a new sheriff in town. And again, Nintex was one of the first to recognize this trend by basically doing an acquisition. But they also launched their cloud platform. So it's one platform to automate content. It's going to enable faster development of those content processes. And obviously, in many cases, far less coding, because you're really dealing with a very low code environment. If I actually talk about some of the CCM stuff, some of those things still run on mainframes. So, I got to know mainframe level stuff, which means I have to have an IT staff, and I also have to schedule job runs. Who wants to do that today, where I can just load it up on a cloud platform and actually process as much stuff in real time or in batch as I ever could on a Z system sitting on some expensive mainframe somewhere? So it's a big deal. It's non-trivial. And in some cases, you move faster and at the same time save money. Okay, the number two is probably one of the most strategic ones, which is your document processes are slowing you down. That's one of the reasons you need to automate. The business people that we talk with, particularly at the C level, they say, look, we know we're on paper and we know we need to be digital, so we're going to do this digital transaction management thing. The IT people sometimes still have to make it all work together. But the new thing that's happening is it's not just about adding a signature to a document. That was 3 years ago. Today, it's about how is that document created? How could I speed up the creation of that document? Could I create that document more intelligently? Do I have to have a lawyer review those documents that are going out for signature? Or is it smart enough to say, the right clauses were inserted, I'm ready to go, and the computer can make that decision? We'll talk about that too. But again, number two is your document processes, quite frankly, in some cases are killing businesses. They're getting outmaneuvered by people that have deployed DTM-based solutions to speed up those transactions. And this is a can't wait kind of conversation. All right, number three, and again, this one might not jump out as much, is to streamline what we call the journeys, the customer journey. And what do we mean by that? We mean basically that if you actually look at how people buy things, they actually are, not only when they're doing the process or doing their research, but when they're in the process of buying from a particular supplier, they're actually evaluating, is this hard? Is this easy? And so customer journey mapping is an area of coverage we have at Aragon. And if you look at your document-based processes, how many different departments in your company actually have to touch that customer? Actually, there's a fair number of them. And how streamlined are those document-based processes? How streamlined is the support journey? Is there a whole support contract that has to be signed? And then when it comes to renewals and things like that. So, it's a big deal. And sometimes people say, wow, that'd be really hard. But if you look at Net Promoter Scores, it's a pretty big deal. So, Matt, I know you know a little bit about the area of journeys, but can you talk a little bit about how Nintex is going to help people improve their document-based journeys?
Yeah, sure. Look, Jim, this is an area that's near and dear to my heart. Background-wise, I had the good fortune of actually leading product at Salesforce for their marketing and their IoT clouds. And what was interesting about that is in the time I was there, we launched a product called Journey Builder, which was really focused on customer journey management and how can you actually put the customer at the center of a journey and help to actually manage that customer through the journey. When I went to IoT Cloud, the journey became much more focused on you have a piece of data or information coming in real time from some sensor, and how can I manage that data throughout kind of the life cycle or the journey of that data? Maybe it's an error or some problem with an HVAC system that needs to go beyond just kind of recognizing that there's a problem to scheduling maintenance, those types of things. I think you're spot on with this. The same thing is happening with journeys. And increasingly, we're looking at, how can you put a document at kind of the center of the journey and kind of make sure that you're doing everything in your power to kind of fully automate and optimize that document through its life cycle to be able to deliver the types of customer experiences we want. You talked about kind of contract lifecycle management. If you think about that piece of it, hey, I have a proposal, I need to get together a contract, and we need to review it and manage that contract the whole way through to signature. That's just one part of the journey. There's steps before that have to happen that engage the customer, that create some kind of an opportunity, that result in some kind of a sales proposal, probably automatically being generated through some type of document generation technology, ultimately getting to a contract, but it doesn't stop there, right? There's a renewal process associated with that contract that has to be kind of managed. And so I think this concept of looking holistically at the customer journey is a really important one. One of the things we'll talk about a little bit later as we get into Nintex is how it seems daunting, but honestly, it really starts with just automating your first process. And so we'll talk a little bit more about how to get started as we go further along.
Great. So let's move on to the next one, which is number 4, which is grow revenues faster. There's sometimes two ways to look at some of these automation things. There's a risk management and there's a revenue management. We're focusing today on growing revenues faster because if you speed up the time it takes to complete a document transaction, generally there's a faster outcome. And so you can really we talk later about how to do this, is really looking at all the different departments, focusing on the externally facing ones generally first and then the internally facing ones. But sales obviously is absolutely a no-brainer. But finance and legal too spend an awful lot of time dealing with different types of things like contracts. Governments deal with a lot of permitting. Human resources deals with a lot of onboarding. If I can get that employee onboarded, can they actually, jump into the operations faster? So it's kind of seems non-trivial, but one of the things we recommend is you actually look at your inventory, all your different documents, and then, decide to jump in and target them, prioritize them. One of the things, after you do some of the fundamentals, number 5, and again, this is really redefining markets, is getting to what we call those digital apps I talked about at the beginning. It's not just about, doing some automation. It's actually about jumping ahead and fully, not only automating, but coming up with a new application. There's a lot of noise today in things like automated mortgages and loan processes, but we haven't even touched the tip of the iceberg relative to the potential. So, again, this is one of the things where, Matt, I know that, you've got the Nintex workflow cloud, and again, you've got a lot of customers, and again, I think you've got some that are doing some innovative things. You want to talk a little bit about how they're putting this to work relative to what we call intelligent content applications?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Jim. Look, I think this is spot on. If you think about any emerging startup today that gets into some industry, whether it's kind of what's happening in finance, whether it's what's happening in healthcare, whether it's what's happening in kind of software development, right? This is natively born into them to think about, look, how do I automate and how do I actually, leverage intelligence to kind of automate the way people do things in smart ways. And so what you really have is we have, more than 8,000 enterprise customers, many who have been in industries for a long time, who literally are looking to kind of reinvent the way that they do business, both internally in terms of their back office, but also kind of in customer-facing ways in terms of their front office to really take advantage of this. And so, if you kind of take a look at a company like AstraZeneca, for example, in the pharmaceutical space, they started out very much what we were just talking about on that customer journey management side of things by just automating some fundamental processes built around kind of the documents required, for example, to take a new drug to trial. A lot of paper, a lot of processes that they had that were very manual that they've totally innovated. But now they've actually gone well beyond that to say, okay, now that we've automated a bunch of our basic processes, we're getting this process intelligence in. How can we really optimize this by really kind of breaking off of kind of that, continuous kind of improvement cycle to really take that revised target path that we're looking at and think about, look, how can we fundamentally change the way we do business, right? So it starts with basically automation. It moves to kind of, analyzing the data you have and leveraging that intelligence. And ultimately it gets into optimizing, which in most of these cases, involves exactly what you're talking about, innovative moonshots to fundamentally change the way they do things, which have exponential impact on their business. You're not talking about 2 or 3x improvements in terms of faster cycle times. You may be talking 100x, 1,000x, 10,000x, and also oftentimes resulting in better customer experiences.
Great. Well, let's talk about how could we get to these moonshots. So we've got a little bit of advice, jumping into this space. And we kind of have a little bit of a continuum here from basic documents and automating those, adding, what we call core WCA, where you start to do automatic routing, i.e. workflow to people. And so a lot of times if you say, hey, we're creating documents manually, so we need to get that started to do automation. And then, when you do the first 2, then you can go from what we call semi to fully automated. Now, that's forward-looking, but that gets at what Matt was just talking about relative to these intelligent content applications, where in some cases a computer, meaning the application, could make a decision on what happens with the next step of that document. And by the way, I mean that's kind of, you could say that's kind of a form of a robotic process automation, but that's really where we think it's headed. So again, basic, core, and then going from semi to fully automated. And again, a continuum where you start with the easy low-hanging fruits like, hey, we need to automate how proposals are generated or permits are generated for government. Let's get that done first. And then let's keep going further into the automation process. So, smaller wins leading to those bigger, intelligent, automated scenarios that we were just talking about, that's a great way to get started. If we talk about the life cycle, then how do you do that? Well, first of all, there's a kind of a loop here. You kind of have to look at your processes that are document related, and we kind of call that creating storyboards. So you have to say, okay, so how do we actually create that document? Who touches it? Where does it go? Getting a whiteboard, getting the teams together, breaking it down, and when you do that, then you can start to say, hey, wait a minute, could these 4 steps be automated? And then you actually go ahead, deploy a platform, like somebody like Nintex, and then deploy it and see how it goes, and then again, resolve the bottlenecks, et cetera. But again, the storyboarding part of that is really one of the areas when people say, no, we didn't do that. Well, why not? Because just when you create, any of you that are video professionals, to create a great video, you have to storyboard it. That's what actually people that make movies do. They storyboard it. Document processes really involve storyboarding. And again, that's a hot tip for those of you that are content professionals. Get an expertise around storyboarding your content flows, and then it's going to be a lot easier to automate them. So again, that's been a quick flyby from me on some of my thoughts, and now we're going to turn over to Matt. Matt, you're going to take the helm here and tell us all about what's going on with Nintex and Nintex Workflow Cloud.
Thanks, Jim. I appreciate it. Look, I'm going to talk a little bit about Nintex, but honestly, I want to kind of pick up where Jim kind of left off, and he outlined some great frameworks for everyone who's participating to think about. And now I want to talk about what we're seeing kind of in the real world. Again, we have the luxury of literally seeing and having kind of firsthand visibility into, millions of processes that have been automated across many different industries, right? And one of the things that's kind of universal as you look across this, and I think builds on what Jim was talking about, is really this imperative, this business imperative that you have to digitize your entire company, beginning with your business processes. And as I alluded to earlier, those processes tend to have 3 things in common. They tend to have people, they tend to have data, and they tend to have kind of documents or content involved in them. So you really have to kind of focus on how can you kind of automate those. And we all know that this is important. We're all kind of marching down this path toward digital transformation. But what gets really interesting is despite how important we know it is, the majority of enterprise processes still remain highly manual across verticals. This is a recent study and data from Lazard that really shows, look, it's less than a third of all business processes that have actually been automated. We talked a little bit about the framework, and where Jim really left off was, hey, look, the first step of this is to automate it. Then you want to analyze it, and ultimately you want to optimize it. We're not even talking about folks who have optimized their processes here. We're just saying, look, it's less than a third of the processes that have actually even been automated in some form or fashion, perhaps even just the first step on Jim's continuum of those 3 steps for workflow and content automation. And so if you drill in a little bit and look at, well, why is this? Well, in many ways, it's because there's been this need to fill this void that exists between packaged and custom-built apps. So at one end of the spectrum on the left-hand side, you've got packaged applications that can help you with automation and automating certain things in your business, help you with content creation and collaboration. But the challenge is they're very low in terms of flexibility, and in exchange for kind of being very inflexible, they are click to deploy, right? That's the advantage of them. At the other end of the spectrum, what you have is things that are actually long deployment times, but highly flexible. And ideally, what you want in terms of automating and digitizing your workflow and content automation processes is you want a solution that kind of brings the best of both of these together. You want incredibly high flexibility so that you can actually automate the processes and do it in a way that maps to how you run your business, but you also want quick times to deploy. And this has been a gap in the market that we've seen increasingly kind of get wider over the last number of years. If you kind of take another look at it and say, okay, so we recognize this, what's required to kind of fill that gap? Our philosophy at Nintex is you need a workflow and content automation solution that can attack the long tail of it. And the only way to do that is to build solutions that are intuitive, so easy enough for the line of business folks to use themselves, so you don't have to stand around and wait for IT to do your automation for you. They need to be integrated. By integrated, they need to be part of the existing tools you use every day, whether that's your CRM system, whether that's your file sharing and syncing system, or your cloud content management system. They need to be integrated into that environment so that you can actually use them as part of the work that you do every day. And as we talked about a bunch earlier, they also need to be intelligent. How can they not only help me automate my processes, but how can they actually go beyond that and give me the intelligence that's needed to really go forward and optimize these? And so if you look at how we've traditionally solved the problem, we've said, hey, we're going to actually automate our processes through approaches that are heavily managed by IT using traditional business process management technologies. The trend there is to move to more low-code solutions, right? But our philosophy is, look, the moment you've actually moved to low-code versus no-code, in many ways you've failed, right? You need to provide solutions that can be used out of box by the line of business workers in finance, HR, sales, et cetera, in a way and in a tool set that is managed by the ops teams with light IT governance, right? And so you really make this transition from, IT timelines and change management to BizOps timelines and really change at the speed of your business. And the best analogy I can give to you here is this is essentially, in terms of workflow and content automation, the shift from doing software in a waterfall fashion, where you map everything out extensively, you go through a long process, you write a bunch of code, and you deploy something on the left-hand side of this, to a much more agile approach, right? And if you think about what we've done with agile software, we've certainly done a lot of things to kind of make sure it's not a free-for-all where everyone's just writing whatever code they want and pushing it out. There's guardrails and governance that's put in tools that help us to do that in a way that can be managed by, or that can be basically governed by IT, but still empowers your line of business folks to kind of do this. And ultimately, this is what we're seeing as being a key to unlocking the long tail. If you take this to kind of a real-life situation, and I think this builds on a lot of what Jim was talking about, here's a basic contract lifecycle management process. And I say basic because, honestly, as you go into kind of even mid-market or smaller mid-market companies, they're typically way more complex than this. And so we've intentionally simplified this down to fit on a slide. But even in this simple example of contract lifecycle management, you will see that you've got multiple systems of record involved in this. You've got data that sits inside of Salesforce, where there may be something kind of that happens with that object in Salesforce, that lead, that contact, et cetera, that requires some type of a contract to be generated, right? That contract needs to be generated, in our case, right, using document generation to automatically generate that content, letting the machine build the content, using data from Salesforce, and maybe pulling data or content from somewhere else, whether that's Box, whether that's SharePoint, whatever the case may be. It needs to tie into your back-end ERP system, and it needs to actually then go out and manage the whole cycle around negotiations around that contract, both internally to kind of get to a point where legal's okay sending it out to the customer, but also the back and forth cycles that happen with the customer. Again, all of this being automated through kind of workflow and content automation. That process oftentimes involves using tools like Office 365 or Google Docs or whatever your productivity suite is to actually make content revisions, right, to do the redlining, to do the approvals, to do the declining. And oftentimes then it amounts to, great, we have a document, now we need to send it out to signature, whether that's through DocuSign, Adobe Sign, some other solution that you're using, only to ultimately have data come back and be written into Salesforce, and then your final document archived and stored wherever you're in whatever system of record or cloud content management solution you want. In this case, we're showing Box, but it literally could be anything, right? And so even in this simple example of one process, contract lifecycle management, you've got multiple enterprise tools involved in it, and you've got multiple departments, sales, finance, and legal, involved in making this happen. And so, you think about it, And this happens routinely across every process, right? There's people, data, and documents that are just waiting to be automated, but it requires something to come in and actually work across these various systems to be able to actually add the content and automation capabilities in a way that's intuitive, integrated, and intelligent so that the line of business can really take the lead on doing this. So at Nintex, our workflow cloud, as Jim talked about, is really designed for the line of business workers to be able to do this using clicks, not code. We've got a bunch of capabilities that center around workflow and workflow automation. We've talked about the document generation capabilities. We've talked about Hawkeye in terms of our process and predictive intelligence. We haven't really talked about it much, but clearly a lot of this process automation involves somebody filling out a simple form to provide information into some process, and it obviously needs to extend out into those various systems of record. I talked a little bit about the framework that we tend to use in terms of, look, how do you get started? This seems very complex. This seems very hard. Well, the easiest way to get started, as Jim was alluding to, is to just start by picking one of your processes and automating it. And if you think about kind of a very visual workflow design tool like we have at Nintex, what that really lets you do is do the process mapping or the storyboarding that Jim was talking about, but you can actually do it in a tool that when you're ready, after you've laid it out, you can just kind of turn on and actually automate right from there. So our recommendation and guidance is pick a process, go in and actually just automate that first process. Let's just say it's that contract lifecycle management example we just talked about. Get it up and running, get the workflow behind it so that things are being routed to the appropriate people for approval, for reviews, whatever the case may be, and layer in the document generation so you're not manually creating document after document. As Jim alluded to, you're freeing up your people's time to be innovative, to be creative, to be strategic, right? The things you want them doing. Once you've automated it, what you can do then is you can actually start to leverage that process intelligence we talked about to get better visibility into what's actually happening with your processes across your organization. Where are things bottlenecking? And then you can come in and you can actually start to focus on optimization. So how do I go in? How do I actually optimize the things that are working, the things that aren't working, and really kind of drive this in a very portfolio fashion across my organization? So it starts with one process, get it up and running, you analyze it, eventually you optimize it, and pretty soon you do that to the next process. And again, this speaks to kind of that agile approach. Rather than trying to kind of boil the ocean, pick one process and get started, get that one up and running, and that success breeds more success in your organization. We talked a little bit about Nintex as kind of being a leader in workflow and content automation. We've been around since 2006, as I mentioned. We've got most of the Fortune 500 as customers, 8,000 plus enterprise customers, some really big brand names across kind of every different industry. And the importance of this is that it gives us great visibility into what companies are trying to do, what leading enterprises are trying to do around workflow and content automation. And it also helps us build up this incredibly rich expanse of process intelligence and data that we can then leverage to help our customers, right, better automate, analyze, and optimize their own business processes. So I'm going to close here by just showing a quick video to the group. And this video is going to kind of bring everything I just talked about to life and kind of show it to you. And specifically in this particular case, we just launched a new Nintex workflow for Box application last week at BoxWorks. I'm going to show you a nice overview video that shows how Nintex is deeply integrated into Box, but this could be deeply integrated into Salesforce, could be deeply integrated into SharePoint. Really, as I talked about, one of our key philosophies is how do you embed your workflow and content automation capabilities into the tools that people use every day. So this is a great example of how you bring this all to life.
For over a decade, Box has helped businesses share ideas, work together, and get more done faster. Truly changing the way people collaborate. Now, Box has partnered with Nintex, the leader in workflow and content automation, to once again revolutionize the way you work. Introducing Nintex Workflow for Box. Nintex Workflow for Box unlocks the full power of the Nintex platform for organizations with Box Cloud content management natively in their Box experience. Now, virtually anyone can automate, analyze, and optimize their own content processes, no matter how sophisticated, without writing a single line of code or waiting on IT. Simply drag and drop to create complex processes that can act on content stored in Box. Easily incorporate data-driven document generation informed by metadata and ready to be securely shared through Box as part of a workflow. Quickly design modern forms to easily move from data capture to action, all driving business decisions. With Nintex Workflow for Box, you can instantly gain actionable insight into the business impact and effectiveness of your Box-centric automated processes. From new employee onboarding to contract lifecycle management and empowering customer service. Move beyond simple automation to achieve process optimization right in your Box experience with Nintex Workflow for Box.
Okay, Matt, great video showing off the new Box and Nintex partnership. Outstanding. So a couple quick summary comments from me. First of all, we think workflow and content automation is going to be a key catalyst in this overall digital transformation. We think it's a digital on-ramp, and it's one of the things that you should leave here and come back on Monday and think about your 30, 60, 90-day action plan to take advantage of some of the information that we're sharing with you. Prioritize your high payback projects first. Start to look at retiring some of those legacy tools, and obviously don't wait to get started. So, Patricia, I think Matt and I are ready for some questions from the audience now, and thanks everybody for participating and looking forward to a big Q&A session.
Okay, great. So yeah, we're going to move into our Q&A portion. There's still time if you want to submit a question using the Q&A widget. We will try to answer as many questions as possible, and if we don't get to your question, we'll make sure to follow up with you offline. Okay, so first question is more of a comment that someone made. In my company, IT is pushing the move from paper to digital while our business partners are dragging their feet. So can either of you talk about what are some ways that you can get everyone on board to move faster?
Sure, I can start, and then Matt, maybe you can tag along. A couple thoughts. Not everybody's going to move at the same pace on this, and you also have sometimes differences with business partners in different geographic areas of the world. Some of that might be based on government regulations, but I think it's kind of cool that IT is pushing it, that they're on top of the trend. But I think, again, sometimes helping business partners to understand the benefits is one of the ways to get them on board. Matt?
Yeah, look, I think that's true, right? I think the other thing that we see often is, one of the things I talked about was starting small. So if you think about even just that contract lifecycle management process I showed that touched sales, that touched finance, that touched legal, right? Maybe it's the sales team that's kind of driving this from an innovative perspective within your business, but automating that one process then exposes those other departments to it, may expose external partners to it. And I think that's step one, is starting small, and by kind of showing what you can do on a small scale, success breeds success and interest, right? I think the second thing is it gets into kind of, look, how do you make this intuitive and easy for the people who need to participate in the process? If you think about contract lifecycle management, we have this philosophy that you're never going to get adoption if you don't have that deep integration into the products that people are used to using. Hey, I don't want to have to go to some website. I don't want to have to go to some tool to be able to do this. If I'm in sales, I want to work from within my CRM system, Salesforce, Dynamics, whatever the case may be. And I think also extending that kind of concept of being intuitive and easy even further is important. So we've taken a lot of strides to actually make it really easy for people to participate in process automation, perhaps without even fully realizing that they're participating. So if something goes out for review and approval, how can you make it easy to just let them reply by an email to either say that they've approved it or not approved it? How can you actually let them reply with comments or suggestions and then automatically apply those comments or suggestions to the document using the document generation capabilities that we have. And so I think it really comes back to that philosophy of making sure that whatever tool you're using to kind of drive this, you need a tool that's actually intuitive and easy to use, and you need a tool that's highly integrated into the products and the systems that your company's already and partners are already used to using.
Great, thanks, Matt. And this is another question for you. We had a few questions come in with a lot of interest about the new Box Nintex partnership. And I know you shared that awesome video, but can you talk a little bit more about the partnership, maybe some things that weren't shown in the video?
Yeah, sure, great. Yeah, look, I think the partnership is interesting from the standpoint of, as Jim talked about, right, and kind of his whole presentation. And as I shared a little bit of the background and history of Nintex, we started out solidly in kind of workflow automation, initially on SharePoint, so in environments that tended to be document rich, but it was really focused on kind of the workflow and managing the workflow side of things. What happened is we naturally realized that every one of these processes has people, data, and content involved in it. And so as I talked about, we migrated into kind of the content automation thing. And so what basically happened was we came at this from a business process workflow automation perspective and really got driven into more kind of the content side of the world. If you look at the companies, who have traditionally been the EFSS companies, the content management companies, the Boxes, the Dropboxes, the SharePoints, the Google Drives of the world, right? What's happening with them is they're being pushed the other direction, right? They're kind of, and again, I think it all feeds into kind of this story that Jim and his team have kind of discovered around, look, the future is workflow and content automation. And so I think both parties coming from both directions are being forced to the middle. And again, I think our success in the SharePoint environment and in Office 365 is a great example of that, but you're now also starting to see that manifest itself in places like Box, their integrations with Dropbox. And so what I would say in terms of the Box relationship, for those of you who know Nintex, historically as kind of being very Microsoft-centric or SharePoint and Office 365-centric, think of it in much the same way, realizing that, hey, many of the enterprises that we serve use perhaps SharePoint for a lot of what they're doing, but they also have deployments of Box or Dropbox or Google Drive or whatever throughout their enterprise. And our philosophy is, look, if you really want to kind of automate this stuff, you need to have partnerships with all of these players and deep product integrations so that you can easily automate this stuff. And so, the Box thing is very exciting. They're very bullish on workflow and collaboration. They've invested heavily in their own tool, Box Relay, for really simple automation and task automation. And Nintex can really help by kind of building on top of where Box Relay kind of lets off, specifically around doing more sophisticated types of automation like we showed today.
Great. Thank you, Matt. And we'll take time for one more question. So I think this is a great question to end on. Someone said, I heard what Jim and Matt said today and about getting started by picking one process to automate, but can you talk about how to choose that process and then how I would get started with automating that process in Nintex?
All right, maybe I'll start, Matt, you can wrap it up. Well, first of all, I think the ones that I would target if I were you in the audience is the ones that are tied to either business impact or revenue. So it's business impact, for example, sometimes it's speeding up a process. For example, if I'm a government, can that permit process be accelerated for one of the constituents? If I'm an entity, can I basically decrease the time it takes to get a contract signed from 2 weeks to 2 hours? So again, focus on that outcome first, and I think that the list will become pretty clear as far as where you start. And then as far as how to get started, Matt, why don't you take that one?
Yeah, look, I think it's focused on where the outcome is exactly the right first step. I think the next logical step is to go talk to the people who are on the front lines of dealing with these processes every day. And honestly, they will point you in the right direction. A phenomenal example is a conversation I had last week with somebody from the registrar's office at Stanford University, right? Talking about this. She came over, knew nothing about Nintex, and said, hey, a bunch of people told me I needed to talk to you. And I just said, hey, tell me a little bit about what you do. She works in the registrar's office. She, deals with everything from kind of, having to kind of, send kind of information out to validate somebody's grades, right, who's applied to the university, to having to actually compile, documents that basically summarize kind of their academic performance at the university and push that off to somewhere. And immediately she honed in on the things that she does repetitively over and over and over again that suck up large amounts of time that prevent her from being kind of innovative, prevent her from being creative, being strategic, right? And she's kind of like, look, we're Stanford University, and the majority of what we do is still very manual, and I spend my time running these manual processes. And so I think Jim is exactly right. Focus on what drives kind of revenue and business impact, and then go talk to your line of business people who are involved in that, and they will point you to the biggest pain points, and that's the logical place to get started.
Great. Thank you, Matt. Well, I think this is all the time we have for today, and I want to thank our great presenters, Jim and Matt. Thank you so much for joining us today. I know our audience had a lot of interest in what you talked about. And for our audience, we want to thank you for tuning in, and look out for an email follow-up that will contain the recording to this presentation in case you'd like to review anything. We hope to see you at our next online webinar.
Take care.